A long time ago, two races lived on. Alright, none of that. This video isn't an immediate sequel to the last one I made, so I recommend checking it out because I will be going into this video assuming everyone watching this one watched that one. You're more than free to watch this one without watching the previous one, of course. I just won't be explaining the concepts I had in the last one, so be warned. Right, then let's get into it. So like I had said in the ending of my last video, I was posting on Blue Sky when a commenter said something I had never seen being mentioned on anything related to Fellswap Gold before. That apparently Muffet and Grilby got married? And imagine my surprise when someone else added on that there was a Q&A from Jotland themselves that answered that. Of course I had to ask where the Q&A was, and she was super nice enough to link it, and turns out she was the person that uploaded all that information to the blog. I almost cried tears of joy seeing how much new information there was about Fellswap Gold that had apparently never been exposed to most people outside the Chinese fan base. So, everyone say thank you to her for making this blog and bringing it to my attention. Anyway, all this had been posted on February 20th of this year, and I know it's all relatively new compared to how old this AU is, but still the posts haven't gotten that much engagement, which I think is a bit of a shame. Like, we've gotten so much new information after having years of nothing. And that's why I'm making this video. I'd love for other fans of Fellswap Gold who've been wondering what other aspects of the AU, what they could have been for this AU. I want those fans to be able to have some closure on the questions that they might have been asking for years. And please bear with me, because 99% of everything on this blog is in Chinese, so I'm very reluctantly relying very heavily on Google Translate. So there might be some things that could have been lost in translation as I went over everything, so please forgive me for any errors I might make. So the first post on this blog, the owner explains how she gained permission to publish all of this. And you can skip over this part if you want to get to the real meat and potatoes of this video. She says that the compilation and release of all of this had been authorized by the original author of the AU Jotland and the Fellswap Gold official settings group chat owner. She then shows two screenshots. The first where she messages Jot directly, and to paraphrase, she says that although Jot had made some things public, there were also details that they kept in private chat records that were spread around privately in a QQ, which is an instant messenger and web portal used mainly in China, group chat. She then says that she wanted to make this information public, assuring Jotland that she'd be sure to properly credit them, and asks if they had an issue with that. Jot responds by saying that it's fine since some of the information is already on foreign websites, which I assume is the English and Japanese Fellswap Gold tumblrs, and that they have no real feelings on the comments of foreign websites, which I guess means they don't mind what those outside the Chinese Fellswap Gold fandom think of that information. The next image is a conversation with the group chat owner of the Fellswap Gold official settings chat, I believe. She asks if Fellswap Gold has a fixed copyright and if there would be a problem with sharing the information that had been shared on the group. The chat owner responds by saying that it's Jot's personal work and it belongs to them, but reposting it should be okay as long as credit is given to Jot. Then in the blog post, she says that she doesn't have the time or ability to translate all the information for those of us who can't read Chinese, but honestly, I'm happy we have all this information at all. She goes on to explain that she did her best to organize all the information in her own way as objectively as possible, but all of this is just a reference. She explains how she sorted them, which I'll be explaining in a bit, And then she thanks the reader for reading, and even if her writing ability is limited, it is her honor that we're reading this blog at all. And ma'am, it's our honor that we're able to read it at all. Anyway, to explain how she sorted the information, she made posts focused on certain parts of the information she got. In order of what each post was focused on, it was the social background, game mechanics, and non-main character NPC details in one, then Chara and Frisk, Temi and Azriel, then Toriel, Asgore, and the royal family's past, then Sans, then Papyrus, then Gaster, the Riverman and Gaster with Sans and Papyrus, then Undyne, Alphys, and NTT, then Grillby, Muffet, and Flowey, then more information on that one neutral route ending where you only spare Asgore, then more details that were brought up in a 2023, extra information ask thing, I'm guessing that they held. Which I'm assuming that most of the information that we got before this post had been made some time earlier in the AU's lifetime, 2018-ish, since it calls the Skeleton Brothers Coffee and Wine, which are the names assigned to their redesigned selves. She does warn that there may be some contradictions in the post that is information that was released in 2023 that contradicts what might have been said and established in previous posts, and chalks it up to Jot simply forgetting some details of the AU as time passed by. I wasn't sure how to organize this myself because a lot of the information cross-references between posts, so I decided to try putting the information in chronological order, so going over the events from the earliest point in the timeline to the latest point that we have. Again, if you'd rather read the blog yourself, please feel free. If you happen to understand Chinese and find any mistakes with what I'm saying, please feel free to correct me. Then, let's get into it. In the beginning, humans and monsters lived on the surface until the humans declared war on the monsters, which happened around the turn of the 1900s. Fearing for their declining population, the monsters took shelter underground, the entrance of which was actually built by the humans to be a bomb shelter. The monsters sealed themselves underground of their own volition and were too afraid of another war happening, so they didn't want to leave the underground. The underground wasn't anywhere near perfect, but it also wasn't as awful as it would become and wasn't as industrialized as it is currently. One of the settings that seem to have been put in place, even ever since the monsters ended up underground, was the super strict hold on the citizens that is seen throughout most of the AU. The underground is divided into different areas like the OG game, but each area is a lot less pleasant than the original game. For example, Snowden is home to detention centers, prisons, and labor camps. The school is located in the old Imperial City, which is the area of the ruins. Children would be sent there for boarding school, since learning children need a stable studying environment. The school focused on sciences, but only very few children were ever in class, since it was all only for the children born from royalty or from the officials. In the detention center, since upkeep on all the prisoners and interrogating them all is pretty costly, a system was set that the cost of food and lodging was deducted from their labor wages. After they deducted the costs and finished their labor, they could be released. Monsters were even given the choice of either staying in there and working indefinitely, or being released to the streets, and most monsters actually chose continuing to work in the detention center since it gave them money that they could use to provide for their families. We'll hold off on talking about Waterfall for now and turn our attention to the royal family at that time. The royal family only consisted of Asgore and Toriel. And see, the Toriel and Asgore in this AU were siblings. Explains why they look alike, at least. but they also still end up getting married for political reasons and to continue the royal bloodline. Their relationship to each other was just lukewarm, and Asgore was still considered a rational and graceful warrior to those in the underground. Gaster was also still the royal scientist at that point. And also, reminder, Gaster is a woman in this AU. The river person, who I'm assuming is male in this AU, also worked at the lab then. And the construction of the core was still underway. Some point between the monsters being trapped underground and Frisk falling underground, Sans was created by Gaster, or born from Gaster, so that part wasn't quite finalized and decided on yet on how Sans came to be. We'll talk about that later when Papyrus comes into the picture, but for now just know that Sans is alive at this point and Gaster considers Gaster his mother. Frisk, who's the first human to fall in this AU, was an orphan and didn't like humans. They wanted to escape the ongoing war happening with the humans on the surface, and they end up accidentally entering the entrance leading to the underground. They were very good at surviving, so they pretended to be a baby monster and managed to get work at a release station in exchange for food. They then end up meeting Monster Kid, who was also an orphan. The two decided to stick together and became very close. They accompanied each other for a while before it was exposed that Frisk was actually a human. The monsters wanted to kill them, but MK protected them and did their best to stop those monsters from hurting them. The news of a human being underground and being protected by a monster child made its way to the monsters in power, who intervened. Toriel, who was touched at their friendship, approved of their bond. She saw their friendship as a sign that humans and monsters could eventually learn to communicate with each other. Since she and Asgore had no children, they decided to adopt them. And because of the two children coming into their lives, Asgore and Toriel end up becoming closer as well. And at that time, none of them knew that Toriel was actually pregnant with Asriel. Which makes me wonder how long monster pregnancies are supposed to last in this AU. Back to the skeletons, Sans had a less than happy childhood. From a very young age, he was trained to be a perfect soldier. A training ground was set up for him that simulated a battlefield, using political prisoners and monsters as his targets. These monsters were told that all they had to do was survive to be set free, while Sans was told that he could go back to his dormitory to rest after he had murdered them all. If he didn't comply, Gaster would force him into solitary confinement for long periods of time. One day, Gaster brought Sans into the lab and told him he was going to have a little brother made artificially from cultivating amniotic fluid tanks. She explains if he was a success, then it would allow them to make citizens that didn't contain any unqualified genes. So, eugenics to the extreme, I guess. When Sans had seen the developing baby Papyrus, he had felt uncomfortable, wondering if he, Sans, had been created. Why was this still in the experimental stage? At first, Sans only saw Papyrus as troublesome and a competitor for his mother's attention, but they also couldn't be separated since he knew it would only cause him more trouble if he tried. His dislike for Papyrus had gotten so bad that he had considered strangling him. Feeling like Papyrus's existence made Sans feel like a failure in Gaster's eyes. When Papyrus grew to be a toddler, he didn't hold eye contact and didn't react to simulation, and they realized despite his strong magical power, he only had 1 HP and 1 defense. So Gaster considered this project a failure and was upset the funding for it was gone. When Gaster had walked away, Sans had made to follow her until he heard Papyrus calling out to him, calling his name and calling him brother. At that moment, something in Sans changed, in which he began to see Papyrus as his true family. When he realized how dependent this constantly crying baby was on him, he felt guilty for how he had felt towards him. Papyrus would hug him and looked at him differently than how anyone else would look at him. Compared to the endless killing he had to do, he felt being needed like this was what truly made him happy. His new goal was to love and protect this one child who'd shown him love for the first time. And to him, to achieve that goal, it meant eliminating anyone who posed a threat towards Papyrus. Since Castor was among the upper class of monsters and Sans was her son, he had to attend the boarding school in the old city, only being able to see Papyrus on the weekends and holidays. While being at school gave him a reprieve from Gastor's training, he also felt reluctant leaving Papyrus alone with Gastor, seeing how depressed and sad he was becoming being ignored by her. He was still punished by solitary confinement for a day or two if he tried protecting Papyrus or talking back at Gastor. Also, Frisk and Sans had attended the same classes together, since Frisk was around his age and they were kind of friends, but mostly just passed each other by. Instead of their home in Snowden, Gaster preferred living in the lab, which meant Papyrus had to live in the lab as well, while Sans lived at the school, so the Snowden house was mostly unused. However, in the short time they did live together in that house, was mostly filled with bad memories with the rare good one. Behind the house, like the original skeleton's house in the game, there is a secret studio. The studio has weapons, experiment tools, and other unfriendly looking things in there. For Papyrus, between the bad memories, there would be small moments of happiness where guests would give him a piece of candy as a treat, and Papyrus would take the candy wrappers, clean them up, and place them into the pages of a dictionary. Papyrus had a classic case of autism savant syndrome. He could be able to easily tell you something like if a 10-digit number was a prime number and draw precise engineering level design maps, even if he had trouble with things like folding clothes and quilts. There's also a problem with the part of his soul that controls speech, so he has trouble talking and pronouncing words. But otherwise, he was a normal kid in terms of development. Gaster mostly just used him as a convenient calculator. Papyrus only called for Gaster by drawing her face on a paper, while Sans was the one who got to hear Papyrus speak, albeit either just saying brother or other simple words. Young Papyrus also ate non-edible things and liked biting his scarf, the end of his pencil, an eraser, and would switch to sucking his thumb when he grew up. At some point during their growing period, more children fell underground. The purple, yellow, dark blue, light blue, orange, and green souls. No details were given about what happened to the orange and light blue souls, though. The purple soul was a scholar who betrayed the humans and helped Gaster study their souls. However, they eventually decided that they would rather just be a specimen as well than continue on like this. They would leave behind a diary that contains their research on monster souls that would have helped lead to a good ending. The yellow soul was a soldier and the dark blue soul was a ballerina, and their ends were a lot more unfortunate. And warning, since it's a little graphic on how they died. The two of them had attempted to escape but were caught and thrown into Sans training grounds, which automatically meant death. Sans had broken the ballerina's leg in an attempt to kill her, but was confused when she didn't turn to dust like a monster would have, so instead chose to continuously shoot her until she was nothing more than a pile of blood and flesh. The soldier had gone crazy seeing this, and instead of letting Sans finish them off, they shot themselves to death. The Green Soul was by far the most fortunate of the humans so far. She, like Frisk, had managed to adapt by being useful to the monsters. She could cook, so she used it to her advantage by providing meals for the monsters until she died. The item equipped she left behind was an old Russian schoolgirl uniform. Returning to the main plot, Sans worked hard in his training and studying to be a good role model for Papyrus and to be recognized by Gaster, but even as he wanted this, he began to realize Gaster only wanted to use the two of them as tools and never saw the two of them as family, so at first he had felt disappointed, but soon it began to turn into a deep hatred towards Gaster. Sans's efforts would eventually be recognized, but at the detriment of Papyrus. In his final training session, instead of killing prisoners, he now only had one target this time: Papyrus. Gaster had said it was a test to show that he was grown up now. At that time, and forgive me if I'm misinterpreting this since I'm a little confused on this part, Sans was made to wear a collar that injected auxiliary drugs into him, which I assume made it easier for Gaster to control him and make his magic go haywire. Sans, not wanting to hurt Papyrus, yelled at Papyrus to attack him instead, so Papyrus could survive, but he refused, saying that he won't hurt Sans. Gaster turned up the power on the collar, so Sans' powers grew out of control and tried to force him to use his magic against Papyrus. Sans managed to avoid attacking Papyrus by attacking himself instead, using his own broken bone weapon to stab into his left eye repeatedly, which is why he can't see through it anymore. When he looked into the camera and asked if he passed, Gaster simply said he did not. And at that point, Sans officially wanted Gaster taken care of for good. Which is where Undyne and Alphys come in. Undyne and Alphys had known each other for a long time. Undyne had been a cheerful young newcomer to the science team, being close in age to Papyrus. She loves superhero comics and wants to be a scientist one day since science is cool. Since she was talented, she was allowed onto the team despite her young age. The team was made up of Gaster followers, who were all also women that were very smart but uncomfortable to be around. And they mostly discussed huge engineering projects and human experimentation in a gloomy manner. When she joined, the team was focused on getting the core up and working, but Undyne wanted to work on solutions on how to save dying monsters. This displeased the team, which resulted in her being bullied and isolated. This caused her personality to shift into the one that she has now. Alphys was a very shy person who wasn't good at speaking, but she was strong, so she decided to join the Royal Guard despite being young as well. One day, she wrote a love letter to Undyne. However, any couple that couldn't produce children were heavily looked down upon, especially same-sex relationships. She didn't want Undyne getting in trouble, so blacked out her name on the letter. She was taken in as a mental patient into a woman's labor camp where she was subjected to torture to try to correct her, but it never made her feelings waver. When Sans found out about the situation, he decided to use it to his advantage. He told Undyne he'd bail Alphys out if she helped him implicate Gaster. There was also another reason he wanted to bail Alphys out. It was because she was strong and obedient, and he had even told her the screams of the other victims were so unpleasant that it made people not want to reach out to them. But you never screamed. Which... okay. Backtracking to the royal family again, if you've noticed, the eyes of the royal family, Asgore, Toriel, and eventually Azrael, are all red. This is because of a mysterious curse that befell the entire underground. Anyone who was king or leader of the underground would eventually go blind, probably as a consequence for the humans that they had killed. It says Toriel is an exception, even though we can obviously see her end up blind as well. However, since there were monsters, there were other ways for them to perceive the world around them, so it wasn't like the leader was completely lost in the world. Because of the queen's worsening eyesight, Gaster decided to ingest a type of medicine that would make her mute, and she switched to exclusively using sign language so she couldn't be as heavily monitored by the queen. Sans wanted Undyne to get her hands on Gaster's diary, and well, the translation reads, search for the parts of Gaster's personal diary that denied the queen didn't understand science, which I don't think that's the original wording, but I'll leave it as is. He also wanted her to record any evidence of Gaster's sign language that showed her angry with the queen and accused her of using that sign language to secretly communicate with the science team because of Toriel's bad eyesight. Undyne would also reveal to Sans that after the core was completed, Gaster had planned to sacrifice powerful souls into it to keep it powered. And one of those monsters written to be sacrificed was Papyrus. Upon learning this, Sans experienced a total mental breakdown. With his promise of keeping Papyrus safe and his new hatred for Gaster, he decided Gaster absolutely had to die. He had actually gotten so angry that he had smashed the door down to confront her, but was forced into solitary confinement and locked up despite being an adult at that point. Luckily, since there was a physical examination to be done before the monsters were sent to the furnace to kill them, he still had time to save Papyrus. Undyne and Sans managed to get their hands on the documents that contained evidence that Gaster was planning to overthrow the royal family and interfere with how the underground kingdom was being ruled. Despite her treatment of him, Gaster completely trusted Sans, and she underestimated Undyne, so she never saw this coming. Since Sans knew her best, he knew how to get her most private data like no one else would have. He knew that no matter who you were, human or monster, information had a way to get emotional reactions out of people. The information they found had been altered, long messages cut out, reorganized and edited so it would get even the queen to react to it. And at some point between the course completion and Sans and Undyne exposing Gaster, the Riverman, who was a researcher by then, had realized that Gaster would soon end up in trouble with the queen because of her views. Not wanting to be involved with this, he escaped the lab and betrayed his fellow researchers by also exposing the information about what Gaster had been planning. Despite turning in this information, the queen had ordered for him to work as an attendant on the railway. The railway was built after the queen realized using the boat in the river was just too slow, so she ordered for the river to be drained and a railway to be built there. She ordered the riverman to never get off the train until the day he died as punishment. On the day of the course completion, Frisk had wanted to go see it for themselves. However, the area around the core was full of nuclear radiation, which they ended up being exposed to and would lead to them getting radiation sickness. They slowly began dying as they suffered the side effects of radiation, from their teeth falling out to their skin rotting and melting. Toriel refused to take Frisk up to the surface for treatment since she knew the humans didn't have a cure for it. As Frisk was dying, Sans had also been in the course area. He had been given a youth merit badge from the queen for having exposed Gaster, and it had caused his outward expressions and temperament to change to what it is now. Because of that merit badge, the lab assistants had no choice but to obey Sans' every command, so he could easily get into the lab. Sans had then pushed Gaster into the core as his final act of revenge, simply saying one final goodbye mother as he did. It seemed that the true final rite of passage into adulthood wasn't killing his brother, but his mother. Since after he had done this, he had completely turned into a monster. Also, the core needs a regular flow of monster dust so it would be able to function, which explains the donate your dust text from an earlier version of the Fellswap Gold cover page. Monsters that died in labor camps would end up having their dust donated to feed the core, transferring their energy into it. After Gaster's death, Sans had told Papyrus that from now on he didn't need to obey or be owned by anyone, that he was the unique and excellent Papyrus. The Queen then came up to Sans and commended him for his loyalty. Whether it was combat or brainpower, she knew he would make a good Legion leader. However, she was surprised that he could kill someone close to him like that. When Sans explained that it wasn't like that and that he was only created by Gaster, the Queen asked if he didn't know he was actually born from Gaster, which is a detail that, like I said, wasn't quite decided on if it should remain or not. With Gaster and her followers gone, Undyne ends up becoming the lead researcher in the lab and taking it over, despite feeling guilty over it. And at the time of Gaster's death, Frisk had also died. MK had been devastated at the death of their friend. Like Azrael had with Chara, MK absorbed Frisk's soul and took them up out of the underground to bury them in their hometown. When the humans saw not only Frisk's body, but the state it was in due to the radiation sickness, they immediately attacked MK. MK only managed to return to the underground and get to Asgore before they turned to dust in front of him. Witnessing the death of his two children drove Asgore mad from grief, and he launched a coup that started a civil war. He wanted to go and attack the humans. Toriel was opposed to this, however, and wanted the underground to be better protected and the seal completely closed. She called Asgore a disaster star that brings disaster and decided he was not suited for politics. Sans figured that if Asgore's plan for war against his humans succeeded, then his brother, his young, autistic and weak brother, would definitely die if he was involved in it. So Sans decided to take care of Asgore before the war could even have a chance to be launched. Sans dragged Asgore through the streets and paraded him around to be ridiculed by the citizens, who spat at him, insulted him, and called him a warmonger. They burnt his posters, his portraits, his sculptures, and then he was imprisoned under punishment for having tried to provoke a war. In prison, Asgore changed from a rational and strong warrior into a crazed, traumatized monster, probably at Sans' own hand. It was Papyrus who secretly stepped in and saved him, taking Asgore into the ruins and shutting him inside. Because of Asgore being exiled there, the connection between the ruins and the main territory was cut off. Now onto the details that were in place between the death of Frisk and when Chara fell into the underground. The Queen would eventually become completely blind. Due to her blindness, the officials turned her into a political symbol and made her a deity in the hearts of the people, while using her as a way to rule over them like some kind of puppet queen. If you've read or seen 1984, she's basically become Big Brother. Portraits of her were put up everywhere, but no one had ever seen her before. When she were to go out onto the streets would be cleared of civilians and everyone would be forced to return home. And if you happened to look out the window, you would see Sans leading the blind queen down the street, telling her that people were waving and smiling at her, that everyone loves her despite there being no one else around them. Speaking of Sans, he very quickly rose in power in the underground and became a dictator. And he had managed to become the person with the highest position in all the underground, besides the queen herself. Even if he doesn't care who the ruler was, he does like the queen, and he could use her blindness to do what he wants. And what he wanted most was to be loyal to the system, since for him, protecting the system meant protecting his brother. Sans didn't care for the lives of the people, and only cared that the underground was operating like normal. If the civilians rebelled, then he would detain them and interrogate them for a long time, or just shoot them down on the spot. Due to his childhood training and this new method of quelling rebellions, his LV is astronomically high, breaking 5 digits high. Even though his attack and defense is average, with all the monsters he's killed, it ticked up by 1 with every person that he killed. Sans' relationship with those in his inner circle, that being Undyne, Alphys, the Queen, and Papyrus, was actually pretty good. When Sans recommended Alphys to be an adjutant, the Queen had no objections to it. Sans and the Queen have regular chats, and since Sans was about the same age as Frisk and MK were, the Queen can't help but think that if the two of them were alive, they would be around Sans' age, so she feels fond of him for that reason. He usually actually works in Snowdin and takes the train to report to the Queen monthly. Though, despite his status, he doesn't want to be king, so even if he wouldn't care if the Queen dies, he also wouldn't take up the throne since Azriel would be there to do so he hopes he'd just become a regent, which is a person put in charge temporarily if the actual monarch cannot rise to power, for example, being underage. Oh, right, Azriel. Well, Azriel was born sometime after Asgore had been exiled, so he had never met his father before. Originally, Azriel had a cowardly, introverted personality, but it switched to him being violent as he got older due to being ignored and neglected from the love he deserved. Despite his older siblings having died before he was even born, he still lives in their shadow as their mother still grieves for them while neglecting him. Undyne and Papyrus also become friends. The two of them like reading comics together, and a lot of Papyrus's books end up in her study. And speaking of her study, since Undyne isn't good with hot places, but the lab is in Jotland, the lab has a room full of water on the 2nd floor just for her. Napsterton was built at some point around this time too. The story of how he was built was Hapstablook / Mettaton and Napstablook both seemed to have wanted to get a body, but Mettaton was originally chosen. Napstablook stole the medical reports so that he was the one that got the body instead. He still feels guilty because of that. Mettaton, though, never really cared about the body. He just didn't want to be separated from Napstablook, and after he left, he felt betrayed by his selfishness. The two of them miss each other, but don't want to meet each other either because of these feelings. He, and I'm going to assume that he uses he/him in this AU since the English character sheet uses he/him for Napstablook, was built to be a representative of underground entertainment to keep the bored underground monsters, well, entertained. His views were the views of the people, so it warded off people from sending hate messages to him. During his time being an entertainment bot, he was still just a box stationed in the lab. Napstablook basically just acted like a computer that automatically produced music and was never seen by the public before, only being heard through the radio or seen as a static image on TV. At that point, all the monsters just guessed he must be a monster like them. Oh, also, Nafsatan does not fuck with Sans. Sans, on the other hand, thinks that Nafsatan is a good machine that fits his values, and he even wants a machine like him of his own. Kinda see why Nafsatan doesn't like him. Back to the skeletons, let's talk about the relationship in this AU. While it's obvious the two of them care a ton about each other, their bond isn't exactly picture perfect. The best way to describe how Sans treats Papyrus is like a strict father. If he calls for Papyrus and he doesn't respond, he'll get angry. Like if he tells him that dinner's ready and Papyrus doesn't come out, he'll just throw the food away. But he would leave a piece of bread for him to eat at his door much later in the night. But when Papyrus does respond to him calling him to dinner, he always responds with a soft thank you. Despite doing so much for Papyrus, he never asks what Papyrus wants or what his feelings are, so he never fully understood Papyrus. He simply thinks of him as some ignorant teenager and didn't want to listen to his immature ideas. He confiscates any junk food Papyrus brings home since he hates junk food, though Papyrus does find where he hides them and eats them anyway. And he turns off the Famicom Papyrus owns if he plays for too long. Actually, let's go over something that I had no idea how to fit into this organically. So, Papyrus is the one who has knowledge on timelines in this AU. When he had first realized that the world was resetting, which I'm sure was at some point before Chara fell underground, he had actually tried to end his own life by cutting his wrists in the bathroom. He was fortunately stopped by Sans, who discovered him before he could fully succeed. Considering everything Sans had done to keep Papyrus alive and his lifelong promise to keep him alive, Sans broke down and cried when he realized what Papyrus was doing and saved him. When Papyrus was successfully saved, Sans switched to anger, which was rare for him. He told Papyrus that he's done everything for him and asks why he can't become what he wants him to be. Sans tells him that he can become strong and survive on his own, so why can't he? Why did he disappoint him? Sans calls him a useless child, that all his efforts were for him, and that Papyrus just wanted to run away like a coward. Then he begs Papyrus not to abandon him. After that, Papyrus never attempts to do that again. He decided to continue living to fulfill his brother's wish, that if his life was a motivation for his brother to continue surviving, then he wouldn't end his life again. Papyrus decides he'll become an obedient child that'll make his brother happy, even considering his own thoughts and desires as not important and non-existent. Even now, he no longer reacts much to the idea of time resetting, just living in the present, being content as long as things are going well. Since Sans didn't truly listen to him, Papyrus never really communicated with him either. And even if Sans asked him for his thoughts on something, he only says it's fine as long as Sans thinks it's fine. When Papyrus had told him that he just wanted to be himself, Sans subconsciously thought, how could he be so at ease being a waste, instead of thinking, this isn't a waste, that's just the kind of kid he is. So yeah, not perfect, but they still love each other as a family should. Also, I don't know where to put this, but Papyrus is a smoker, and since Sans forbids it, he smokes in the woods, but when Sans is especially stressed, he takes his cigarette from Papyrus's room and smokes it despite not liking it himself. The two brothers had some kind of relationship with the Riverman. The two had interacted with him at some points in their childhood. It seems that their relationship was a positive one since Sans calls him his old friend and his mother's colleague, while Papyrus calls him big brother as well, though only did it by writing it on a note. So the Riverman could have been one of the few people in the lab that were actually nice to the two of them as children. Now, let's go over the different aspects of this underground that I didn't know how to fit into the section above. First are food stamps. Food stamps are the main currency of the underground and were introduced rather recently since supplies in the underground were getting scarce. Food stamps are what people get paid with to buy daily supplies. Food, water, electricity, books, daily necessities, anything else you could need to live off of. And it's what Chara would have been rewarded with after encounters to buy items. There is a second currency though, which is good old reliable G, or gold coins. Gold is only meant to be used by bureaucrats and upper level monsters and is used to buy stuff like computers and radios and even guns, or in Brady and Caddy's black market. The Flowers in this universe run a secret bank where food stamps can be exchanged for gold at a whopping 1,000 food stamps to 1 to 2 gold. And since one food stamp is exchanged for like 1 gin, which I think is like a can of food, exchanging 1,000 of these is equal to 3 gold, with 1 gold coin being given as an extra to Flowey for being the middleman. Also, Sans was the one who came up with this whole exchange system. Now onto the main areas of the underground. Like I mentioned before, the ruins were the old imperial city, which now keeps the exiled Asgore prisoner. The Snowden area is mostly made up of detention centers, prisons, and labor camps. Snowden has solar lamps at the top of the cave to provide lighting that's being powered by the coal. Since monsters had read that humans get sick without the sun, they thought that making an artificial sun would be beneficial to the monsters. The citizens were only told that the Royal Research Institute came up with it and made no mention of humans at all. Also, Muffets is located in Snowden. She runs a fast food place where you can buy her food with food stamps. People have posted anti-night messages on her storefront and they get detained when they're caught. Muffet is spared from this since she's only renting the store. Since there's so many of these stickers, the budget for cleaning them all is still waiting for approval. She's usually asleep since it's a self-serve place and won't talk to you. She simply tells you to just serve yourself and to not bother her. Her donuts can be bought in the ruins for food stamps, but if you try buying them from her, they'll cost 9,999 G, since they're supposed to be for special people. But her employees keep secretly taking them away to sell them, which makes her angry. She's also an otaku who loves writing. There's so many nerds in this AU. She also wears a coat that's said to belong to Grillby's when she sleeps at the counter. On to Waterfall. Its waters are unclean and carry radiation. It houses an abandoned nuclear power station, which was shut down after Frisk's death. The nuclear power station is also the garbage dump where goods for the human world gets watched into. In the underground, it's forbidden to read entertainment programs and books from the surface, and the citizens are told that these types of books are filled with lies. But monsters still scavenge in the dump for items from the surface, and there are monsters who specialize in selling these goods, like Nice Cream Guy and Burger Pants probably being 2 of them. Since they're scattered and not an official organization, Sans hasn't seen the need to intervene yet. The scavenged items are those technically forbidden entertainment products, and even game consoles invented by humans, which include harmful information like humans killing monsters, humans being greater than them, everything those in power don't want the monsters thinking is true. Since monsters still make their own handicrafts and other items, they don't need the scavenged items, so they're just kind of an extra thing you can have. And Papyrus's own Famicom and games were also scavenged from this area. The royal family had forbidden the writings of anything that talks about the situation with the royal family or the current social situation, and if you're caught doing so, you'll be imprisoned. Moving on to Jotland, Jotland is filled with arms factories. Everyone thought that weapons are a good way for maintaining their safety. Grilby owns a bar that sells arsenal. He only deals arsenal to the upper echelons of the knights and other royal agencies. He also owns a club, but it's private. Grilby and Sans are good friends, and he even provided the ammunition Sans and Papyrus use in their Gaster blasters. Papyrus also could have gotten his cigarettes from him. Grilby is nearsighted but doesn't wear glasses because he thinks it's embarrassing and he wants to look cool. As for the new home region, I couldn't find anything explicitly talking about it. We do know that Nafsatan does have a entity skyscraper somewhere around either there or Jotland, and that the castle is located there. The river, like I mentioned before, had been drained and is now a railway. It had also been noted as the only place where Sans and Papyrus could reminisce about peaceful childhood memories before it was ruined, which sucks. All over the underground, echo flowers have been built. Like mentioned in my previous video, they were inspired by the telescreens in 1984 that center on building up the country and defending the monsters, which is said to be very boring. They also have a monitoring function that can record and store conversations from passerbys that you can selectively view. Since it's mentioned that every civilian also plays the role of a secret policeman, I'd imagine everyone is pretty careful about what they say at any given time. I think that's about enough world building to get you up to speed to where we need to be now. Now to move on to the events of what would have happened in the game. I'll do my best to follow the flow of the Undertale storyline as best as possible. I'll mostly be using second person point of view, so you're, as I'm talking about the progression of the story, since technically you're the one supposed to be playing. In enters Chara, a human child that was just an ordinary quiet elementary student that was bullied and committed self-harm. They had originally wanted to die by going into the mountains. After falling into the entrance, you meet Temmie and begin your journey. As you go through the ruins, you meet Asgore, who we now know has gone insane because of Sans. Despite his condition, he does want to genuinely protect Chara. He wants you to stay since he's still affected by how he couldn't protect his previous children and wants to be given another chance to protect this human child. When he guards the door to the rest of the underground, he actually has green mana replenishing flames. Realizing that he had tried hurting you, he calls himself a bad father and realizes Chara would be miserable with a father like him. He tells you to go away and not come back, saying he will hurt you because he's a bad father. Which, you know, he's not a bad goat papa. Also, you probably would have met Mettaton somewhere in the ruins, maybe? But there's like nothing talking about him that isn't connected to Napstaton, so who knows how that would have gone. After leaving the ruins, you would make it into the Snowden forests. You would find a small note and see a figure running away from it, which would turn out to be Pyrus. The note contains a self-introduction as well as a recommended place for you to hide. He's worried that you would be deceived by Sans and have your soul extracted by him. He had also written, "My brother is a good brother, but he will be very cruel to an outsider like you. Please don't trust my brother." Continuing on, you would meet Sans. He'll initially welcome you and then leave you to crawl through a very dangerous puzzle on your own. If you manage to get through it, you'll end up having to fight him. He doesn't want to kill you, since monsters have been told that touching a human soul will cause them to fuse with it and have the human take over their body, so killing you and having your soul exposed was just too much of a risk. Instead, he'll do his best to severely injure you based on his understanding of the human structure, since he had failed the first time he fought a human. Also, despite being a soft sans, he doesn't use the something sans format, since Papyrus is the one who uses it in this AU, remember? When your HP reaches 1, you'll wake up in prison. There'll be a note from Papyrus telling you how to escape, and even saying that he had sawed a strip in the middle of the cage to help you escape, and says he'll give you the key to leave. When you approach Sans again with the note, he'll immediately stop imprisoning you or trying to hurt you. He'll ask where you got a note from his great Papyrus, and since he thinks Papyrus has made a friend, he won't arrest you. Instead, he'll get Alphys or his other subordinates to do it for him. Now, if you want to befriend him, then his little date/hangout would have just been him asking you to talk, and would be referred to as a meet and talk. If you tried asking to marry him, he'd simply say he needs permission from the queen for that kind of political marriage. He'd dress up all spiffy in a nice formal suit like a gentleman for this meet and talk. And it would look like he has a belly sticking out, but turns out he actually had a plate of farfalle hidden under his clothes. Sans actually has a very large dressing room filled with fine handmade men's clothes, as well as some fine clothes belonging to Papyrus that Papyrus doesn't wear since they're too formal. During their talk, he would get out some wine and glasses and tell you some things about the underground. Like talking about how the monster's hatred for the humans, despite many of them never having even seen one before, was instilled by the rulers, who sacrificed so many civilians for a concept that no one really understood. He would then toast the prosperity of the underground, clink glasses with you, then drink the whole bottle of red wine straight from the bottle. Did I mention he was an alcoholic? He would also mention that he was trying to quit since Papyrus didn't like his drinking, and has gotten down to just half a box of wine a day. It's a good thing monsters can't die from alcohol poisoning. Continuing on, you'll meet Azrael, who we don't know anything about Chara and Azrael's relationship or how they would have interacted. Just how he was living in Snowden and probably would have shown up in the areas that the original Monster Kid would have. The dinner scene you would have had with Sans in the original game that took place in Grillby's would be had with Papyrus at Muffet's. He tells you that he doesn't want to grow up. He explains that when he does grow up, he fears he'll end up like his brother and doesn't want that, showing that he does harbor a very slight resentment towards his brother underneath the love he has for him. He hopes that time will stay in that moment forever. You move on to Waterfall, where you'd run into Alphys at some point probably. Again, no information about how Chara and Alphys would have interacted, but since she takes her job seriously, it probably would have been really hard to convince her to not kill or capture you. Also, if you'd killed anyone, she will never become friends with you. You can also take out loans from Flowey's bank if you can't afford certain things, but if you do, your G value would plummet to negative 9,999 eventually. No matter how much you make, the interest would make it impossible for you to pay it all back. You won't be able to purchase things from the black market anymore, and Flowey would call you an idiot. Fun fact, when Sans was a child and when Frisk was still alive, Flowey had taught the children's courses about economics, and through simulated trading, he got every child in that class to become 99,999 in debt. When you enter Jotland, you'll meet Underhine, and you'll find out that she keeps her comic books private, and although they contain worlds full of violence, they also have a lot of freedom, which is what she likes about them. Also in Jotland is Grillby's. Since you replaced Muffet, he would be the one to fight you. But if you bought one of Muffet's donuts and he sees you have it, he won't attack you. Instead, he'll blush and say that since he and Muffet are good friends, he won't hurt you. and that he can't kill the friend of the one he loves. And yes, Roby loves Muppet in this AU. He'd normally never say it since he's embarrassed to do so and simply just says he thinks her desserts are delicious. If you give it to him, he would be surprised. Ask if she asked you to give it to him and say how happy he is to receive it. Also, if the fact that Muppet sleeps with his coat on to keep her warm in her store says anything, I think the feelings are reciprocated. Moving on to NTT, Napsatan only switches to his human robot form when he has to fight Chara, which was broadcast to the whole underground. When the monsters found out he was a robot, they all feel deceived. After he loses the fight, calls come in calling him a liar that's not even as good as a human, until a certain ghostly caller comes on and tells him that despite this, he'll still be waiting for him to come home. Napsatan, desperate at that point, lets Chara go so he can turn off the live broadcast. Finally, you'd arrive to meet the Queen. However, Toriel doesn't attack you. Instead, she hugs you, saying that you remind her of the child that she lost. However, plot twist, she ends up killed by Azrael. He breaks down and asks why Toriel never looked at him or asked for his opinions on anything. He brings up how she always kept reminiscing about his dead siblings or hugging those broken babies, which I assume is meant to refer to the dolls of them that she has in her character sheet, but had never shown that love to him. He declares that from then on, he won't be asking for love anymore, and that he will be the new emperor of the underground. Then you'd be given the choice to either kill him or grant him mercy. In a neutral run, if you give him mercy, he would end up ruling the underground and you would get neutral runs related to him being the ruler. And if you fight him, you would get neutral runs showing another monster being the ruler depending on who you've spared. However, if you're going the Pacifist run, in the initial playthrough, Tammy would be the one to kill him. Tammy would say that they were sad. They explained that after they died, they attached themselves to the doll of their best friend that they loved, and gained the power to reset. Whenever they saw a monster die unexpectedly or tragically, they would reset time, but no matter what they did, the monster would still die. They ended up losing their enthusiasm and feelings for the underground and felt like they were in some kind of video game where everything just kept starting over and no one progressed. You can continue asking them questions and then they'll finally decide to reset just one more time for you. Now, to follow the pacifist route, we're gonna backtrack a little. After befriending Alphys and Undyne, you'll get the letter Alphys wrote for Undyne. It's been many years since she first wrote it and it's yellowed and aged, but you're tasked with delivering it to Undyne. Like mentioned before, same-sex relationships do not receive the Queen's blessing like relationships that can produce children, but since Chara isn't a monster and doesn't need the Queen's blessing to do anything, you'd be able to deliver the letter for Alphys, which would progress to the true lab scene. When you enter it, you'd find the Amalgamates. They were actually made up of prisoners who Undyne was supposed to execute, but instead she tried to save them. She explains that if anyone found out, she'd be taken to a labor camp and the Amalgamates would be killed. She begs you not to tell anyone since she didn't have anyone she could trust, and they were her only friends. This is when you deliver the letter, telling Undyne that she isn't alone and that she was loved. Now we go back to the scene with Toriel and Azrael. This time, before Azrael could kill her, he is pushed away by Asgore, who had left the ruins. Azrael would then absorb the 6 souls and become the big bad god of hyperdeath, and would need to be defeated by everyone together. The pacifist ending would have the monsters question everything they knew about humans. They had been told that humans were utilitarian, selfish creatures obsessed with collecting wealth and doing everything they can to squeeze out the benefits from other species. But then you came along and proved them wrong. You didn't care about HP or LV or status or power and went through the underground trying to get home without hurting anyone. So they decided to finally leave the underground with Chara as their foreign minister. When they reached the surface, they see that there were traces of war on the surface that were now covered in green plants, and the remaining weapons that could be used had been forgotten about. The monsters then decide to follow the human referendum system to choose a new leader so they would no longer have a king or queen. So basically the monsters learn democracy. After getting to the surface, the monsters don't abandon the underground. They still have their self-identity as monsters even if they live in the human world now. The only issue they had with the underground was the fact that resources were scarce. So now people can go and return as they please. Sans is also very good at managing the communication between the monsters and the humans. When the monsters got to the surface, Sans asked Asgore if he remembers him, and Asgore responds that he didn't. To which Sans says that's good. Yeah, definitely good. Toriel's eyesight would eventually cure itself. Apparently, it wasn't caused because of the curse, but instead because she missed Frisk and MK. After giving birth to Azrael, her sight eventually began to leave her, but began returning after she saw the type of person you've grown to. Which, I'm a little confused on that since it says her eyesight got worse at a point before Frisk and MK died, so I think this might be one of those contradictions mentioned earlier. Also, the relationship between Sans and Papyrus would improve after this, so yay! Okay, but what about the other endings? Well, starting with the neutral routes, though to be honest, any ending that isn't pacifist is pretty dark. Any death you cause affects the mental state of someone else. Hell, that's proof enough with the fact you can't even befriend Alphys if you kill anyone. If you kill some monsters that aren't of any importance to him, Sans will actually praise you, saying that you've become a more skilled soldier. If you kill Alphys, he'd become slightly unhappy, asking if you're trying to take her place, and saying you're not even close to her level. If you kill the queen, he'll simply say he has thousands of ways to rule, even with the queen's death, and doesn't mind trying them out one by one. You can also kill the river person in this AU. If you can manage to get your hands on a shotgun in Jotland and ride his train, there's an option to see if it works by testing it on the river person. If you do, he'd actually be relieved, asking if he was finally going to be freed. After his death, Sans would tell you did a good job, that experimenting with one's own weapons is the most primitive desire of any soldier. Papyrus, on the other hand, will leave you a note saying he knows what you did to his big brother. If you don't kill Azrael, then no matter which monsters you kill, he'll always be the ruler. Probably except for like 2 specific circumstances, which we'll be talking about a little later. Azrael ends up becoming a tyrant of a leader. He's weak and incompetent as a leader, but since he has royal blood, he'll stay in power. No one can control him anymore, so he will no longer return to the right path. Azrael puts Sans into house arrest, and Papyrus apparently goes missing. In terms of power, no one can measure up to Sans, and he isn't someone who'll just run away from things. If he's wanted and is required to serve a sentence, he'll do it willingly. The outside world thinks he's just been transferred to internal affairs work, but he's just under house arrest, just like when he was under Gaster's control and put into isolation. Papyrus goes missing on the surface and wants to release his brother, but it isn't easy. Despite not being controlled by him, Azrael will keep trying to find and threaten him with alcohol of all things. But it doesn't matter since Papyrus knows it'll all reset anyway. We went over some endings where you kill all the main bosses but Asgore, Undyne, and Nafsatan in the last video, and there's some information on some of these endings too. In the Undyne-only ending, the robot she built was actually a replacement for Alfie's that had the same speech patterns and behavior as her. In the phone call, she would say that she can make substitutes for other people, but she can't make her look at her. The substitute can speak, but now she can't even remember what Alfie's looks like anymore. In the Asgore-only ending, the phone call that would take place would happen over 40 years later. In the call, it would be immediately obvious that Papyrus has gotten used to speaking more since he speaks in a fluent manner. He'd greet you by saying, "This is the landline number for the palace's diplomatic liaison. You are welcome to call." You may not be familiar with my voice. You may be surprised that this person can actually speak. Papyrus has taken over his late brother's position. He has inherited the duties of the head of the royal guard and works as the king's deputy. Asgore isn't able to rule due to his mental trauma. Smoking has become much more common for him, and he tells you his consoles are covered in dust and his comic books are moldy. He says that to you this ending might seem like a few minutes, but it's been decades for them. So in just a few moments, you could also erase it all. He knows that you're curious about other endings, so you'll come back. He says that just as his brother wanted, he had ended up taking his place. He had dreams in which his brother says he's grown and that he's proud of him, but in reality, Papyrus had never heard Sans say words like that to him before. He asks if he'll come back to fulfill his wish to see his brother again. The next part of this says these underlined or maybe lines below are from a call after everyone leaves the underground alive, but it might be after a genocide run, or maybe it's after a pacifist route that was followed by a genocide run. Not completely sure. Anyway, Papyrus says he always dreams of his dead brother, that Sans would touch his head and tell him he's an excellent child, but he never says such things in person. He only asks if that's all he's achieved, that a man should look forward and do better. Sans could laugh and talk with hateful people and persists in boring and tedious work year after year. Papyrus hates it, but the things he hates still happen. He's growing up and he's becoming a person like his brother. He says that he knows you, that your life as a human is coming to an end, and that the mountains are your only way to return to the past. That you want to see different endings, so he's been waiting for decades. You will come back, and he will be under the same tree, turning everything he's experienced after the ending you've achieved into a vague memory like a dream. And there he will wait for you again with his brother. He then says goodbye. Also, in a neutral run where you kill all the bosses and some monsters, the monsters of the underground would take down the royal statue while Papyrus would grow up and be left wandering without purpose. If you only kill the bosses but none of the citizens or Azrael, it'll lead to an anarchy ending. Azrael attempts to escape, but when he leaves the underground, Chara will catch him and kill him. During the after-ending call, Papyrus wouldn't say a word, but you could hear his bones trembling and teeth shaking. To dip our toes into the genocide route, if you've killed too many monsters, even Sans decides he needs to put a stop to it, saying that you've murdered too many people. He'll then fight you with all his power to stop you. However, if you decide to spare him, Chara would cut off his legs to prevent him from blocking your progress, which, karma's pretty crazy, huh? In this case, Sans will go crazy, regardless of if you continue the genocide route from here or not, and enter the tyrant ending. He'll end up having to be equipped with armored prosthetics. Sans would find this humiliation even more painful than death, turning him into a stubborn, resentful, and self-centered person that's hell-bent on denying anything related to humans. Sans will become suspicious and distrustful towards everyone, including his own followers. If there was anyone in a higher position than him, he'll immediately, but secretly, order for them to be sentenced to death and executed. He'd use any means in his disposal to maintain his rule. He would have Papyrus imprisoned, fearful that something bad would happen to him when he isn't looking. His overprotection would go into hyperdrive, and because of the atrocities he's committed, Papyrus would stop talking to him. Muffet and her customers can't be killed regardless of the route you decide to take. Hell, if you talk to the customers, they'll only shrug off the fact that you've killed people since it doesn't have anything to do with them. However, if Grilby sees you have one of her donuts during a genocide run, he'll assume the worst had happened and that you'd done something to her, and he'll fight you, his fight being even harder than it was originally supposed to be. As you walk to the Judgment Hall, you'll find a note from Papyrus saying a few short sentences. In the Judgment Hall, because you've killed all the people who loved him and the people he loved, Papyrus would desperately try his best to kill you, using the weapon his brother gave him despite hating it. Since there are many industrial pipes, he'd hide behind them for cover when you attack, causing your attacks to miss. Finally, at the end of the route, you'll meet Frisk. Throughout the game, they actually would have given you prompts like how people theorize Chara does for the original game. They would tell you that this was all your own wish, so they can't stop you, but they'll keep watching over you. Since it's said that when you decide to go the genocide route, that's all on you. That's not Chara's fault, that's not Frisk's fault, that's on you. Frisk is calm towards the genocide because they've seen you so many times, and their memory hasn't reset like it has for everyone else. So presumably, they'll always remember what you've done no matter how many times you reset or try erasing your progress. Now, on to hypotheticals to lighten the mood. Things that probably never would have made it to the main story. The first, what if Undyne and Alphys or Grilby and Muffet got married? Like I've said before, marriages where the partners can't reproduce don't receive a blessing from the queen. In this case, since Undyne and Alphys are a same-sex couple, and in this AU only monsters of the same species can reproduce, and Grilby and Muffet are different species, their marriages wouldn't have been blessed. However, you won't get locked up, just criticized, and made to be outliers in society. Not being blessed means that no one should be allowed to attend the wedding, since the queen's non-blessing is meant to be everyone's non-blessing. These weddings would have those wedded exchange rings between each other alone. However, weddings in this underground are supposed to be a positive event that is celebrated. Blessed marriages would have received a royal blessing certificate. Now, in this hypothetical world where Grilby and Muffet got married, Grilby would arrive in her store and propose to her with a bagel. And when she accepts, Grilby would be so happy that he whips out a gun and shoots into the sky, taking out one of the solar lights. When the queen asks Sans, who lives in Snowden, why one of the artificial suns were destroyed, Sans would actually cover for Grilby and say that Grilby and him were just testing ammunition in a low-temperature environment, which would get some praise from the queen. If Grilby and Muffet or Undyne and Alphys got married, Sans would attend them both. As long as it isn't reported to the queen, then she doesn't have to know. Another what if is, if you read those fanfics where multiple Sanses and Papyri end up in one universe, if that happened in the Fellswap Gold universe, probably while they're still underground, Sans would immediately attack them and shoot them down without saying a word, to prevent the other monsters in the underground from learning alternate worlds existed. Which, is certainly one really short fanfiction waiting to happen, huh? Before I go to the outro, maybe please consider checking out my Patreon if you're enjoying this type of video. If you want the script for this video, you don't want to have to watch the whole video again, you just want to get to the parts that you want to read through, then it'll be uploaded there along with any of my other scripts from at the highest tier that I have there. So, just consider maybe supporting me through Patreon if you have the money. I'm hoping that I'll be able to use any income that I use from it to be able to buy a proper microphone, besides this cheap one that I have now. Anyway, there are a few details I left out, like some attack and weapon details and who San's dad is, but, well, the posts are there for you to see, so give them a read. Give the posts some love while you're at it. Going over all of this sent me on a huge roller coaster of emotions, honestly. If I could give so many of these monsters a hug, I 100% would have. Especially Sans, and especially Papyrus. My poor boys. They've officially cemented themselves as some of my favorite versions of Sans and Papyrus ever. Well, I'd hug all the monsters except Gaster, for obvious reasons. Anyway, I think this will be the last long video I make on Fellswap Gold. There's not exactly much I can say on it now, since that's all the information that we got on it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please consider subscribing, commenting, liking, all that jazz. And I hope I'll be seeing you in the next one. Take care.